What's going on? It's Mike from 424recording.com, and in today's video I've decided to release my premium drum course, Ready Set Record Drums. It's all about recording, mixing, mono drums. I decided to put it up online for free for your enjoyment as a thanks to everybody who's been joining the Patreon. And I also just don't really feel like I want to sell online courses anymore. It seems silly to have this stuff behind a paywall, and I think there's a lot of great information. And I'm not the best drummer, keep in mind, but at the time I felt like I had a lot to say and a lot of information that could help people record drums. And I still think that this is a great course that I made. It's just that I'd rather have it be out there and have people enjoy it and maybe learn something from it rather than it be behind a paywall. So that's where I'm coming from with that. And I just want to move more toward, a donation-based channel where if people enjoy the stuff I'm putting up and want to support it, you can do so through Patreon or through some of the affiliate links I have in the description below with the equipment that was used in this video. I just think that's going to be the best sustainable way for me to do the channel going forward. So I'm kind of trying to condense all of my stuff down, all of my social media and things, and just focus on what's important and what I actually want to do. So I hope you enjoy this Ready Set Record Drums mono drum recording course, and I hope you get something out of it. So let me know how you like it in the comments. All right, without further ado, here's Ready Set Record Drums. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon, you nerd. Welcome to Ready Set Record Drums. This is Mike from 424recording.com, and I'm so happy to have you here with us today to record some drums. So let's get started. This is module number 1. It's a small slide presentation about getting ready and set to record drums. So let's do it to it, all right? Next slide. Okay, so first off, I just want to say thank you for taking my course. Super pumped you decided to invest your time and money into the course, Ready, Set, Record Drums. And I just want to say if you have any questions about the material or anything that follows, please feel free to hit me up anytime at 424recording@gmail.com. It would be my pleasure to help. And see that you have everything you need to get ready and set to record drums, all right? All right, let's get started, okay? It's going to be fun. So the first question I think we should ask ourselves is, what if recording drums was easy? Or to phrase the question another way, what makes recording drums hard? Because you hear a lot of people talk about how drums are a very hard instrument to record, which I think is true. But I also think it depends how you look at it. And it often helps a lot of the time to ask the opposite question when you're approaching a problem. So what if recording drums was easy? Drums are a collection of multiple instruments making up one cohesive sound. Unlike other instruments such as guitar, bass, and vocals, drums have multiple sounds occurring in multiple frequencies of the sound spectrum. In general, a guitar has one sound source, such as an amp, that we need to mic in order to capture that guitar's sound. Drums, on the other hand, as you know, have a snare drum, a kick drum, one or more tom-tom drums, a pair of hi-hat cymbals, a ride cymbal, and one or more crash cymbals, depending on what your drummer uses or what you use as a drummer. So right there we have at least 8 different instruments making up the sound of the drums. Each one of these instruments has a unique sound and a unique presence in the sound spectrum. You're starting to wish this was a course on recording guitar amps, huh? Here's the trick to thinking about drums. Drums are one instrument. We don't need to overcomplicate it. A lot of literature and how-tos on drum recording emphasize how complicated recording drums is, but in reality, recording drums is simple. We just need to start by thinking about the drums as one instrument. So if we follow this line of thinking, and as I'm sure you have experience recording, how do we generally mic one instrument? With one microphone. And that's it. It's super simple, but I'll show you how doing so gets the job done every time. But what if I want to record with 8 mics, you ask? I say go for it. It's something that's worth exploring. But let me ask you a quick question before you go off and do that. What if you didn't need to? What if you could start out every drum recording session with the best sound possible from one mic and build the sound from there? What if you only needed to use 3 mics or 2 mics or even just 1 mic If one mic sounds good, go for it. There's no reason to use more mics than you need to use unless there's a specific job or sound that you're going for. You don't necessarily need to use 8 mics. I've heard drum recordings where one mic sounded better than all the 8 mics that were turned on in the room. So here's the 2 things that I think you need for a great drum sound. Number 1 is a good drummer. And number 2 is some kind of drum kit that you like the sound of. I'm not pulling any punches with this one, okay? To get the best drum sound possible out of whatever drums you're recording, the number 1 thing you're going to need is a good drummer. There's seriously no shortcut here. If you're the drummer, practice. Practice to your favorite songs, practice to a metronome, practice on your practice pad, practice, practice, practice. I can't overemphasize how much practicing and getting your parts down and understanding how to play the kit will take your recording that much further. Because good drummers know how to play the drums to get the sounds they want out of the kit. They know how to balance the sounds and volumes of different drums and cymbals in the kit. And they know what to play to suit the qualities of the song they're playing. Now, I know I'm not an amazing drummer. Anytime I don't like the sounds of the drums I'm playing, it's because of the way I'm playing them, or not playing them, if that makes sense. But I do know how to play the drums to get the sounds that I want. Smashing the cymbals rarely generates the desired sound I want out of them, unless it suits the song, which it usually doesn't, to be honest. I know my taste in drums is simple, and always serves the music I'm recording. The number 2 thing you need for a great drum sound is some kind of drum kit. And the reason I say some kind of drum kit is because you don't need a $3,000 drum kit to get a good drum sound. If you have a $3,000 drum kit, but you can't play the drums, what will it sound like? Or what does it sound like? Obviously, you can see where number 1 comes into play here, and I put them in this order for a reason. A good drummer can make any kit sound good. The key is you have to like the sound of the kit that you have. Obviously, the hardware and kick pedal have to be in workable condition, and trashy cymbals aren't going to work unless that's the sound you're going for. You know, I'm not going to lie, I think cymbals is one place where you should splurge a little bit and spend a little bit of money to get ones that you like, if the ones that you like cost a lot of money. So you may need to acquire cymbals that you like the sound of. For instance, in my situation, a few years back, I bought a kit for $50 from a friend. It was a 5-piece kit, all the hardware, a crash, ride, hat, stool, it was everything. The kit works and sounds great to me. It's some cheap no-name brand. I don't even know, I don't think it has a name on it. But the cymbals that came with it were not cutting it. They were a super cheap set of, I don't even remember the brand. They were all of it was like a no-name kit that somebody had gotten as like a gift or something. So I spent some time researching and playing different cymbals, going to different stores, playing some used cymbals, playing new cymbals, listening to videos even online of specific cymbals, until I found some ones I really liked, and I bought them used. What I'm trying to say is you don't need an expensive drum kit to get the sound you want, but you do need some kind of kit you like the sound of. After you have that, tuning the snare, tom-toms, and kick to how you like the sound of them is all it takes to getting the sound you want. New drum heads can help, but if you like the sound of what you're working with, it's not always necessary. As you'll see in Module 2, I don't have all new heads on the drums, but that's because I like the sound of them. I figured if it ain't broken, don't fix it. So one last thing to remember is that drum tuning is important and not something to be overlooked. When setting up for the drum recording videos in this course, I took an entire day to set up and tune the drums to how I wanted them to sound. My mantra for recording drums is, the best the drums will ever sound is the way they sound before you record them. Really think about it. With recording, the best anything will sound is the way it sounds before you start recording it. So take your time to get ready to record. This is such an important step that I overlooked for years. Recording drums is actually easy if you get the sounds right at the source before you ever start recording. The more time you take to set up and get the sounds right, the less time you'll spend mixing because you'll be learning to mix as you record. It's a super simple approach, but a powerful one if you take the time to get ready and set to record. Room sound. Does the room I record my drums in matter? To some extent, yes, but it's not something to worry too much about. Some of the greatest studios in the world, like the now defunct Sound City, had a live room that they refused to change because they weren't quite sure what made the room sound like it did. As recording moves away from the professional realm and into the rooms that musicians have available to them, who knows what sounds we will discover. So yeah, I wouldn't sweat the room you're recording in too much. Spaces like attics, where the room isn't completely rectangle or square, are usually the best, as the sound waves aren't just bouncing back and forth. Also, if you're planning to close mic the drums, the room doesn't matter too much either. And who knows, maybe the room sound of your non-traditional recording room will be the sound everyone wants on their next recording. Hey, it's Mike from 424recording.com. I'm sure you already know that, but welcome to Module 2 of Ready, Set, Record Drums. So in this module, this is really the bread and butter, or the meat and potatoes of the course. We're going to be taking a look at 1 mic recording, 2 mic recording, 3 mic recording, and 4 mic recording. Like I said in Module 1, it's best to look at the drums as one cohesive instrument. So we're going to be looking at some very simple techniques to get the best sound out of recording the drums. Once you record with more than 1 mic, you can run the risk of phasing issues, which is an important concept that we'll cover in depth in this module. So for Ready, Set, Record drums, I wanted a really simple approach to recording the drums. So I decided to just use 3 of my favorite mics for drum recording. So the first and simplest mic that I used was this SM58. It's a dynamic mic, and it's going to tend to give you a more of a darker sound. The second mic I use, which is basically the polar opposite of that, is the AKG C414. Now this is a really expensive large diaphragm condenser microphone, and you don't need to get one that's this expensive to do obviously the techniques in this course. But so this is going to give you more of a bright sound when it comes to the drums. And last but not least, I have a ribbon mic. Now I think that the ribbon mic personally is one of the underused, unsung heroes of drum recording. And then maybe that's just my personal taste, but I think there's something about ribbon mics that I've always found picks up exactly what I'm hearing in my room or my drum kit, what it sounds like. So definitely gives you a more smoother, darker sound. I'd recommend trying to pick one up. This is the Aventone CR14. Very cool mic. Definitely recommend trying to pick up a ribbon. I mean, you don't need to get new mics to do this if what you have is like SM58, SM57, a large diaphragm condenser, but definitely think about picking one up at some point. They're just a great mic, great sound, and I kind of wish more people used them and talked about using them. Very, very cool mic. That's a ribbon mic. So I chose these 3 mics because they're all different types of mics. You know, we have the dynamic, the large diaphragm condenser, and the ribbon. I think that these 3 mics are pretty great at achieving a great mono drum sound, which is always what I like to start building the drums out from. I also wanted to show the different sounds on tap from 3 different types of mics. So with each mic, I decided to record 3 different examples to show you different sounds and what things sound like in different areas of the room. The techniques I've showcased are over the shoulder, overhead, and out front. I think each one of these techniques gives you a pretty good and different sound for the drum kit. Over the shoulder is great because it gives you a picture of the drum kit of what it sounds like from the drummer's perspective. The idea is to basically just put it over the shoulder, about ear level of where the drummer is, and point it at the snare drum so that it picks up the snare drum centered and everything around it. Let's take a look at what that sounds like with our 3 different mics. The next technique is a mono overhead. I deliberately decided not to include stereo condenser mics like pencil condensers. Personally, I've never had a pair of those that I really dug the sound of. And I'm also not as into panning things crazily wide. I think if you can get the hang of using one mono overhead and getting the best sound that you can, from there it's great to experiment with pencil condensers or, you know, a stereo pair XY, and that's something I'll cover probably in another course, the advanced ready set record drums. But I think you're better off learning how to do a simpler technique, and then once you're comfortable with that, once you've mastered that, moving on to, you know, more of a advanced technique. So with a mono overhead, usually I try to mix it with in the middle of the snare and the kick. Basically you're over if you're a righty drummer, over your right knee. You can adjust it as you know, record a little bit, play it back. You know, as far as the height, I would say put it above the drum kit and check out some different levels of what you like. Obviously, if it's higher up, it won't sound as close to the drums, and if it's lower, it'll sound closer to the drums. But with each of those movements, you have to keep in mind that depending on how you're playing, you may have to adjust your playing style or how hard you're hitting things to get a good balance. Experiment with that one, you know? I don't think there's any real hard and fast rules here. I'm trying not to include hard and fast rules because I think it's more beneficial to put up a mic and see what it sounds like. Once you start taking the tape measure out and saying it has to be here, it has to be here, like nothing has to be anywhere, you know? Just use your gut, use your instinct. You know, you're putting one mic over the top of the drums. Put it somewhere where it can see everything and pick up everything that's below it. And generally, you know, a lot of drum sounds, the most important instruments are kick and snare, so you're going to want to balance those two instruments with the overhead. And that's why I say to, you know, wherever you have it, aim it down sort of between the snare, floor tom, and the kick drum over the drummer's right knee or left knee if they're a lefty drummer. All right, so let's take a look at what some overhead positions sound like. So out front is also a technique you can use for recording mono drums. The idea is that this is a position that's, if somebody is watching you play the drums or listening to you play the drums, that's the idea behind this, the out front position. Because sometimes you can be in a room with the drummer and say, man, this spot right here sounds really great. And that's a really helpful technique if you have somebody else, is to walk around the room and figure out a spot where the drums sound good. In general, I would say, you know, 3 feet out, 3 feet up is usually a pretty good one. Again, aimed at the snare, maybe a little bit to the left. If you're looking at the mic, it's a little bit to the left, not completely dead center. But again, it's a matter of experimenting and what you want it to sound like. I always usually try to center my mics on the snare because I think that's the most important instrument in modern rock music and a lot of modern music. I mean, the snare is what really dictates the entire sound of the kit. Like if the snare sounds good, the snares in the mix, you know, that's kind of what's keeping the beat, what people are really listening to subconsciously or consciously. So out front is another good technique, and this is also, I guess, considered a room mic. You can get an idea of what the room sounds like and what your drums sound like further away. So you can also experiment with moving this mic further out and closer in, depending on the sound that you want. Let's take a look at some out front sounds. All right, so from those examples, I decided to go ahead with my AKG overhead and the ribbon out front as the two mics for this part of the module. Those three positions with those different types of mics are always a good place to start in building your drum sound out. I really like the sound of these mics separately, so it made sense to combine them to get a little bit of a room sound from the ribbon and a closer, brighter sound overhead with the AKG. In general, there's a rule about phase, because this is where we're going to start getting into phase cancellation. Phasing won't occur if you're at a ratio of 3:1 of a distance away from a sound source. So we'll cover more of this in the phase section of this module coming up, but just keep in mind that as long as your mics are far enough away from the same sound source, you most likely won't run into phasing issues at a ratio of 3:1 distance. Just keep that in mind, and we'll talk more about it in a minute. So yeah, I really thought the sound of the brighter overhead with the smoother, warmer ribbon sounded great. So here's what I got. For my drum sound, I really like the close-up sound of the overhead that's a little bit brighter. And I also like to do some things with a room mic sometimes. So I always like to have at least an overhead, which is picking up most of the kit, and also a room mic or an out front mic like the ribbon. But also because, maybe that smoother sound of the ribbon may trump the, brighter sound of the overhead. Or they just have like a very complementary nature to them. Also out front, worth mentioning is that you get more of the kick drum because the bass waves are longer than higher frequency waves, so it takes longer for bass waves to develop in a room. So when you're out front, you're picking up more of the low end of the drum kit. So if you have the luxury of using 3 mics on your drum kit, the next mic that you want to consider setting up is a snare drum mic. Especially when I was listening to the 2 mics, the AKG overhead and the ribbon out front, I thought that the snare could be a bit louder and also a bit more punctuated in the mix. And being that, like I said, I think it's probably the most important instrument in the bigger idea of the drum set as one instrument. We're gonna maybe want that louder, and we can do some other things with it if we have it isolated. So to mic up the snare, I just used an SM57, which is probably a mic that most people have lying around. It's the traditional working horse mic of studios everywhere and live venues everywhere. I decided to use this one just because it's pretty readily available, and also if you have an SM58, you can turn this into this by taking this top part off. But so for the snare drum, this is what it looked like where I mic'd it up. It's a pretty basic technique for miking up a snare drum. I just have it SM57 pointed dead center at the snare, like right above the rim, to get the attack of the snare. So let's take a listen to the mix now with the snare drum. Whenever you record anything with more than one mic, you run the risk of phase cancellation occurring. Phasing occurs when the sound wave of one sound source is picked up by 2 different mics at different times. Basically, if you're using 2 mics, you should be making the sound bigger or adding to the sound. So the number one tip off for when phase cancellation is occurring is when you add a second mic and it makes this drum sound worse, or it makes them sound smaller. Because the whole idea of adding more mics to the drum kit is to enhance the sound of what you're recording. So if by adding more mics it's not enhancing the sound, then there's a good chance that phase cancellation is occurring. The idea behind the 3-to-1 rule is that it's a different part of the same sound source's wave hitting those mics, so it doesn't matter if, as long as it's far enough away, because the same part of the sound is going to be reaching that mic that's 3 times away later, so it's not going to matter if it's that far away. You run into it when the mics are very close to the same sound source, or distances away, and this is why people get into tape measures and like measuring things out. I don't really subscribe to that method. I would say just have fun, set some stuff up, and listen with your ears and hear how it sounds. Because I think when you start busting out the tape measure, you're taking away from the creativity of the moment. And while I think there are certain standards when people record, I think you got to figure things out for yourself, have fun, take a listen, and armed with some basic techniques, just go out there and do your thing and try different things. And if you're worried about phase cancellation, there are some really easy ways to test out if it's occurring. So one of the simplest ways to check for phase or to flip phase is if you have access to a DAW. If you're recording digitally, there's usually a plugin in DAWs called gain plugins, or some sort of utility plugin that will allow you to flip the phase of the sound wave that you have the plugin on. So in Logic, this is in the utility folder under gain. And once you open the plugin, you just hit this little phase reverse on-off switch. So basically what happens when you engage that is that it flips the sine wave or the sound wave over, so that when it's up against the same sine wave or sound wave, it's not going to be canceling out or phasing out. So if you watch the channel for any length of time, you probably know that another one of my favorite pieces of gear is the Art Tube MP preamp. Basically just a small preamp that has a couple different features on it. But one of the important features that it has for this conversation is phase reverse. So this is a way in real time to experiment with phase. If you think that phasing is occurring but are not quite sure, or if you're not sure what to listen for, you can pick up one of these preamps. I think they're like $40–50 these days. You could probably find one used. And this is one of my favorite pieces of gear because it's cheap and effective and does a really good job in a few different ways. So I'm not really an advocate of telling you to like go buy certain things. Like, I think you should just definitely use what you got, but I think this is a super useful tool and a really easy way to, if you're worried about phasing occurring when using like a 2 or 3 mic setup, you can use this preamp with one of the mics to just flip the phase, and then you won't run into any issues as you're recording. It's a really cool little piece of gear and something worth having around. And the third easiest way to combat phasing is in the DAW. This is a super powerful trick. If you can hear what your mics sound like by themselves and you like what they sound like as you're recording, like, phasing won't be that big of an issue, because in the DAW, all you have to do is zoom way in on your sound files and then bump them all back and forth. Find a transient that's really prevalent, like a snare hit, and then line all those files up where the sine waves start. So you could record, I don't know, 8 mics in a room if you wanted to, and went around individually saying, okay, I like this sound, I like this sound, I like this sound. And say you didn't have time or you didn't understand phasing, then you could just, in post, if you like the sound of each one of those, you can then just go back once they're in the DAW and time align them. Just drag them all back to the same starting point, and and you'll really hear what your drums sound like when everything is in phase. Because I think phase is probably the #1 thing that keeps people from getting a good drum sound. So I hope these 3 techniques give you an edge over combating phase. And it's really not hard to combat phase. It took me a while to figure these out, and of researching and experimenting and recording. But I think everybody's probably had that experience of gung-ho, ready to record a drum set, and then once you start recording it and using multiple mics, it doesn't sound how you want it, or it sounds somehow worse when using all these mics. And phasing is usually a big part of why that occurs. These 3 techniques on phasing should get you through any situation when you're recording some drums. If you have the luxury of now recording 4 mics, another instrument, part of the bigger one instrument idea of the drum kit, is the kick drum. Kick drum is pretty important, obviously, as well, and it's going to be a big part of the low end of your overall mix of the drums. So you're definitely going to want to consider picking that up separately in order to manipulate that, aside from the bigger picture, the mono drum sounds of the kit. For that, I use this trusty Samson Q kick. I've had this one for years. I think it was only like $100. It's a pretty cheap one. It's a dynamic mic, and it just sounds good to me. I like the way it sounds. I know how to use it. I know where to put it to get it to sound how I want it. Kick drum, again, the same kind of idea. There's a couple different ways to mic it. You can put the mic like all the way into the kick drum, which will give you more of like the beater sound. You could put it almost right at the sound hole, which will give you more of a lower, boomier sound. And if you're still struggling with getting a lot of low end out of the kick drum mic, if that's what you want, you can always move the kick drum mic out away from the kick drum. These three techniques are all very different and worth experimenting with. For this example, I just had mine pretty much right at the hole. Bass waves are longer than higher frequency waves, so they take a longer time to develop. If you have the mic further out, you're going to be picking up hopefully an entire wave of those bass waves. Now, even though I'm using this as the fourth mic, you could also obviously mix and match all these different techniques that we just covered. You know, you could use an overhead with a kick drum mic. You could use the out front with a kick drum mic. You could use the over the shoulder with a snare mic. You know, it's mix and match at this point. For the example of this course, you know, I built the kit out around, you know, basically a 4-drum mic setup that's pretty easy to attain, and also covering concepts that are the simpler, more basic ideas that I think always get a pretty good sound of the kit. So, you know, if you only want to record with 2 mics, or you only have 2 mics available, or you're recording on something like a 4-track, I mean, if you don't have a sub mixer or another mixer, you got to determine what aspects of your drum sound that you want to be more prevalent. But I mean, in general, a mono overhead and a snare and a kick is usually good. Covers everything. Basically the idea is like having one mono mic, whether that's out front, overhead, over the shoulder, and then adding to that with either the snare or the kick drum. Honestly, with the overhead mic, I feel like I could have just used the AKG overhead as my drum sound for the recording of these drums. But in post, if I want to do more with mixing and the kick drum sound, the snare drum sound, it's good to have those on separate tracks, isolated as much as you can, so that you can manipulate those in any fashion that you want. Experiment, you know, like take a look at the different aspects, you know, ask yourself when you're recording whether there's something that you want to sound louder or more of, or if you're missing out on, or if something needs to sound closer. That's usually a good reason to close mic the snare, the kick. Here's what we got with the 4 mic setup. So I think that pretty much covers the basics of mono drum recording and 4 mic recording. In the next module, we'll take a look at mixing. All right, so welcome to Ready, Set, Record Drums module number 3. I didn't want to leave you guys hanging without showing you a little bit of what we can do with these tracks now that we have recorded them, to clean them up a bit, use some compression on them a little bit, just to get them a little bit more polished, I guess you would say. Now, I think one of the more useful uses of the DAW is that you can phase align everything relatively easily, like I explained in module number 2. And as you can see here, I just left myself a little note that said everything is in phase and ready to go. So the first thing we're going to want to do is just a quick check on the levels. Whenever you have multiple tracks recorded at a good level, which is usually between about 12 and 6 on here is what I usually try to go for. Whenever you stack tracks, you're going to wind up with them peaking on the master here. So let's take a peek. Yeah, see here, right here. So basically I just highlight all these and we're just going to drag them all down a little bit. That out, make sure it's good. That's about, I guess, where I like it to be when I'm mixing, right? Ooh. Alright, we'll take it down a little bit more. In general, when you have the drums and bass, it's good to have them peaking at around RMS around 6, peaking around 3. So since the bass isn't even in here, and that's something else in the future we'll have to talk about, I don't know, helps to start the mix lower. You can always raise the volume as you're listening to it. So now that we've brought everything down volume-wise, now we can take a listen to the mix of the drums. Personally, I think this sounds pretty good. Maybe the snare could come up a little bit. Maybe the kick a little bit. And since I raised them up, we'll just bring them all down again relative to each other. So, because now that I've raised these up to 6, I should probably bring them all back down. I mean, I raised these up to 4. And now since I had raised these up to 4, let's just bring them all down a little bit. Alright, I think that sounds like a pretty good jumping off point. And that's the beauty of, kind of mixing as you're going, as you're recording. That was the whole reason that Module 2 is set up the way that I set it up, was basically to show that as you build out your kit and you build out your sound, you can essentially be mixing it as you go. Because right now I think we have an awesome starting off point from where to start mixing this. I took a lot of time, as I said in module number 1, just tuning the drums and getting them to sound how I wanted them to sound in the room. So now I feel like there's a lot less things that we have to do on the back end here. But we're going to do some cool stuff to clean these up a little bit. Alright, so the two main things we're going to take a look at in this module are equalization, or EQ, and compression. So in this DAW, how you add EQ is just clicking in this big box here. And since I have them all highlighted, they all go on. Saves a little bit of time. A little tip there for you. It would definitely be irresponsible to say that you don't always have to EQ things if you like the sound of them. But there is one technique that I think is important, which saves you headroom and also just cleans up the tracks. So I looped this section of it. Now we're going to take a look at the EQ of the C414 overhead that we recorded, the first track. Okay, so let's take a look at the EQ of the solo, and we'll solo out the C414 overhead track, and then we will take a listen with this EQ. So I'm going to turn on this high pass filter, or a low shelf, I guess, and start. This will give us a good idea of what this sounds like, right? So there we have the high end, more the mids, and then the lows. And basically what we're listening for is where, when you start shelving this, does it drop out? Do we start losing some of our picture? Obviously there, we're losing a lot of the low end. And maybe down here, we don't hear much of a difference. I don't hear any of a difference. So as a general rule of thumb, I would say it's never a bad idea to shelve out frequencies that you can't hear. Because this is not affecting our sound, but it's affecting the amount of headroom and the amount of space and the energy that's in the low end. Because there is information here, even though we can't hear it. And it's information that's going to be taking up space in our overall mix. So this is just a way to clean things up. Let's take a look at the low pass filter or the high shelving. Obviously this is a lot more drastic. So I don't know, maybe something like that. We'll take out a little bit. So this is the first move I would say to do on each track, and this is just cleaning things up. Like I said, eliminating some of that low end and high end that either we can't hear or that's going to be taking up more information in the mix. Let's take a look at the ribbon mic. Now this one has a lot more of a low mid sound. So with the C414, that's capturing more of our high end, and with the ribbon, it's capturing more of the kick drum because, like I said, it's out front, so you're getting more of the kick drum. And also, just the ribbon has a much more darker, smoother, warmer sound. Let's do something similar to what we did on the C414 track. You know, the analyzer is on this one. You can use the analyzer. I'm not going to say don't use it, but the thing with the analyzer is you can get caught up very quickly in what it looks like. And it's very helpful. Obviously, you can see, okay, look, maybe around 40 is where we got our kick. Something happening with the kick here. And then look, there's something going on here. Whether we can hear that or not, let's take a look at it. I just like to usually use it off so that you can use your ears rather than rely on the visual of the analyzer. Not that the analyzer is inaccurate, but as always, this is recording sound, not recording the video of the analyzer, right? So while this is a useful tool, I don't like to rely on it personally. Obviously, we cut way too much out, just as over-exaggeration as an example. I don't know, maybe something like that. You know, when we do this, where do we start hearing it and where do we not hear it anymore? So like, obviously here it's cutting something out. Maybe around here, I don't really hear much of a difference. We'll say somewhere around here. All right, cool. Now, when it comes to the snare and the kick, you may want to do more EQ moves than that. And let's just get into it. I'll show you what I mean. So let's hear what our snare sounds like. So you can hear a lot of the hi-hat coming through there. So that's something that we can either take out or adjust. Or hey, you may need that if your hi-hat's not loud enough, right? But the idea behind the isolated mics is that we're getting the isolated sound of those instruments, the snare drum or the kick drum, or if you had tom-tom mics, etc. But as with a drum kit, like we said, it's one instrument, so it's the overall sound of all these instruments making up one sound, so we're obviously going to have some kind of bleed happening in some of these mics. Let's take a listen to what we got. Again, the analyzer's on. Oh, I guess this is useful to take a look at where it is. So look, we have a little bit of the kick coming through. Here's where the meat of the snare is. Maybe some of the high end is here. And then up here, I guess we're getting some of that hi-hat coming in. So let's turn that off and let's do some shelving. That sounds pretty good. I mean, we may need to adjust it, but for now, let's see what happens on the high end now. This should be really interesting. Because we don't want to take out too much of the high end where it cuts out some of the high of the snare. Unless we just want to use the meat of the snare, but maybe something like that. Yeah, let's do that. I'm kind of listening in for the snare here. But so now if we turn this on and off, snare doesn't change all too much, and that's what we're looking for. We're just trying to clean up so that we have mostly the snare and this mic and not the other instruments that came through. Obviously there's going to be a little bit, and you could go through here with a noise gate if you wanted to, just get the hits of the snare and kind of, close the noise gate, close the gate when everything's, when the lower stuff is happening at a lower volume. But I don't think you need to go that crazy. I've seen people been on sessions where they go through and literally cut out all the silence and fade them in, basically a manual noise gate, and that's cool if you want to do that, but I think it could be overkill for the purposes of this course and also for the purposes of recording in general. When you record the drums, in this fashion, you're going to be getting a little bit of bleed. That's just part of the game. All right. Finish that whole mix. Now let's take a look at the kick drum. Getting a little bit of that snare in there. That's about it, and we have our kick drum. We got a lot of that beater in there, and we got a decent amount of the low end. Let's take a look at our EQ here. Oh, again, the analyzer, I guess it's just default on. Although the first one, what's okay. So the analyzer's on again, so we can take a look. But see, check it out. So now it looks like, obviously here's where your kick drum is in the mix, right? Looks like about below here, and then the beater is somewhere up here. But let's see what happens as we shell out some stuff. Now that's more of the beater sound. Now you see how that kind of cleans it up as you take out those lows, because the lows tend to muddy it up. Like handling the low end is super important when mixing drums and bass, because at some point you need to decide who is going to be the king down here. Who's going to be the lowest of the lows. Most mixes I like to do, I have the kick drum lowest and then the bass is above that. So kick drum in general maybe falls somewhere between 20 and 100. Bass is somewhere between maybe 50, 80, and 200. And everybody's happy down there. But let's try about 40. And then let's see what happens with the high end. This is going to be interesting too. You can kind of see right here. I believe that's about where the beater frequency is. Well, obviously there's no hard and fast rule. It could be depending on the sound of the click, but see how this is now way more low end heavy. I want to keep a little bit of that click, so let's do something like that. Cool. Now, when we turn all these off, it's probably going to be pretty subtle. Or nothing at all. We're just making small moves here, cleaning these up. It's not going to be huge drastic difference because I didn't do anything too drastic in the shelving, but we did clean it up. And it's these little moves like this that'll add up to something a lot bigger when we get to the end of our mix. Now, the kick drum, I do like the way the kick drum sounds here. So we'll keep that in mind as we go forward. Maybe we need to adjust the lows a little bit, but overall, I'm digging this. And that's like a basic shelving high pass filter tutorial in taking out information that's there that maybe you can't hear as much. But even though we can't hear it, it's still going to be taking up room in the mix. So clearing up some headroom for ourselves. All right, so let's talk a little bit about compression. I think that one of the best compressors for beginners and also for starting out and learning on is an 1176. I also think it's a great one to have, whether you have a plug-in version or a hardware version. Prices of them are coming down a lot, and you can, and even the DAWs have free ones. Like Logic has a compressor, their new compressor plugin with Logic Pro X. They basically have an 1176. They don't call it that because that's kind of the model or the brand number. But, you can find them in a lot of different amalgamations. But I think for the purposes of this course, it's also a very easy one to show you how it's set up, how to use it, and explain all the knobs and features and things like that. So basically, when we're compressing signals, we're trying to eliminate the dynamic range of them to give them like a more smoother, polished sound. So if I really want this snare to like kick out of the mix, because right now my snare sounds like it could be have a little more of a punch to it. So let's see what we can do with the compressor, and we'll explain as we're going along here what we're doing. So I have it set up right now at what I think sounds pretty cool. So off, here's what we got, and then I'll click it on. This is right now this is off because of this button here, and then this is the gain reduction, or basically turning this meter on, basically turning the unit on, passing the signal through the unit. Let's talk about why I have it set up like this, what it's actually doing. Input sets the input level and the compression threshold, or where the compressor is going to kick in, and where the volume of the signal, in this sense, the snare drum track, will start to be compressed. So everything above 30 dB will be compressed with this setup on this compressor. Basically once the signal goes above the threshold, or at this point, which is set at 30, it'll be compressed. Now moving over to the right, output sets the final level of the signal. So once the signal goes through the compressor compresses it or limits it. Because as compression isn't actually making things louder, it's actually making things quieter. So that's why there's an output knob on compressors, so that you can get the level back up to a level of an acceptable level, or the level it was at before you put it through the compressor. Because the compressors take the lowest volume spots of the track and the highest volume parts of the track and just compressing them so that they're all one level. So compression is actually lowering the overall level of what's being compressed. So we use the output to raise it back, now compressed, to around the level it was before we compressed it. Moving over, attack is the time it takes the compressor to respond to the signal, or for the signal to be fully compressed. So in this example, it's more of a quicker attack time. Release is actually the opposite of attack. It's the time it takes the signal to return to the initial level. And then the buttons are the compression ratio. So it's 4-1, 8-1, 12-1, 20-1. 20 and 12 are more limiting. As you can see here, even though this is a 1176 compressor, the name on it is a limiting amplifier. So I guess compressing and limiting are two sides of the same coin. It's just limiting is a more extreme version of compression. So yeah, the lower ones are for compression, the higher ones are for limiting. And when the input level goes above the input threshold, so once the snare track goes above 30 dB, everything above the threshold will be compressed by a ratio of whichever button we choose. So for instance, the snare track is at a ratio of 4-1, so once the snare level goes above 30 decibels, everything above 30 will then be compressed at a ratio of 4-1. So that's why I have everything set up how it's set up here. Let's take one quick listen, and then we'll adjust some of this stuff on the fly to see if we can hear the difference, and I'll explain some other things about what's going on. Okay, so if we now raise the input, check out what happens. We get more of the room in there. As we go lower, it goes back to unity. Now gain, now it's not affecting it at all. So if you want a subtler compression on the snare, you can go adjust the input accordingly. You could go really wild with it. I feel like now we're getting into like Blur Song 2 territory there. And that's why I have it back around here. Even there sounds kind of cool. It really just depends on taste, you know, and what works with the track. Obviously, we're just kind of giving some examples of mixing drums and stuff. So now the output level, I mean, it's still compressing, but we really can't hear what it's doing, which is why we need to have the output raise it up. Again, I think bringing it back to around 18 is a sweet spot, even a little bit above. I tend to go a little bit too hard with this stuff sometimes, so I'm trying to be a little more, for the purpose of this demonstration, a little more, subtle with it, or I'm trying to rein myself in a little bit. Let's take a look at attack. Kind of more of a subtle move. I'm honestly not hearing too big of a difference with this. I mean, snare drum is such a quick transient. Release, you can hear it. You can hear the difference and see it on the meter here. See, the level's being reduced by at least 10 decibels, 20 decibels. And now it's being released a lot quicker, so it's getting back to zero a lot faster than it was. Because remember, release is the opposite of attack. It's the time it takes the signal to return to the initial level. So we want that to happen a lot quicker rather than have it slower. And then let's see what happens when we change the ratio. It's not bad either. Now we're going to be starting to get into like limiting. More of a crack to it. It's subtler, but I'm sure once we change the input, we can really hear the difference. A lot more of the room coming in, a lot more of the just a lot more compression happening, a lot more limiting. Now here we might want to make the attack a little bit quicker. Alright, and off again. Very different. It's starting to bring in more of that polished sound, or more of I don't know, very very different sound when we turn it off, right? We had it around 30, right? 30. Whatever sounds good, really. Now off. Yeah, so 1176, a quick little primer on compressing a snare. I hope that helps with compression, and it's a little bit tough to wrap your head around, but I think it's a matter of messing around with a compressor, understanding what each one of the controls does, and again, that's why I like the 1176, because it's a lot simpler of a layout, and it's a good one to learn on and get a grasp of what things are doing, how the meter's working, what the ratio does, and how compressing is compressing your signal. All right, so let's take a look at adding some compression. We'll add the 1176. So here's the initial program of it. All right, let's set the input first. This is where the signal is going to start to be compressed. Let's solo it so you can really hear it. And worth mentioning, I mean, this sounds pretty cool. You know, you could use just this one mic as like the intro or something to your song, you know. Sometimes you hear tracks where it starts out, drums are really far back like this. And a lot of times when you start soloing out tracks, you're like, oh, maybe that's just this type of a track. So that's pretty much unaffected. All right, so I think let's hear what it sounds like in the mix. Setting the output a little bit. Yeah, so the release is really where the magic's gonna happen. Nice, I think I'm feeling that. I'll leave the attack there. Let's just take a look at what the different ratios sound like. Whoa. Probably a little too crazy. Yeah, like I said, I tend to go overboard, but cool. And like here, let's A-B it. Cool. But so yeah, that's a pretty easy way to go about setting up some compression on your kick drum. Just use your ears, you know, set up with, you know, basic understanding of the compressor, which I explained in the snare compression section. Bring in the plugin. You could even start with everything at 0 if you want, but the initial program or the initial settings are a great place to start because, you know, once you go below, I think it starts at like 36, like you're not going to be feeling too much of a difference, and same over here, you know. I would say within this range is where the magic happens on the output, within above 36. Attack and release depends on your input and what you're compressing. And then the ratios, I mean, start with 4 and see what it sounds like. And then you can go through and check them out. Oh yeah, one other thing here, I would probably just bring this down now. See, now we're taking out some of that really boomy low end. It's really going to depend on the mix. And maybe we'll leave it there for now. So let's take a quick look at some parallel compression. Let's get a little crazy. I'm feeling a little crazy. I want to get this. I want to give this a little bit of an edge. Let's set up a bus in Logic. You might have to look how to do this in your DAW, but in Logic, you basically just go to the send on the track and you choose a bus. Boom. The original signal is going to the stereo out, and then the second bus signal, the send, is going out to this bus, and then that's also getting bused to the. Let me bring up the mixer here. So we just created this aux by making this bus. And now we have the original signal here, and then our affected signal going into this bus. We can send the amount over here. And then, so now rather than just saying, okay, like for these, and for instance, the snare, this compression is always on the regular snare track. That's now part of that track. But for this, we're saying, well, I want to keep that original sound of that ribbon mic, but also now add in this other compression that I'm going to show you right now. So we're keeping the original signal intact, the original sound intact, but also creating a second track that we can affect it on and give it a little bit of spice, as I usually say. Let's do it to it. So the first thing we're going to do is just raise the bus up to 0 so we can hear what we're doing. And obviously, that raises the volume a little bit. So let's grab the compressor again. Here's the initial program. Oh yeah, one thing worth mentioning is that these compressors, 1176s, have a mode on them. It's like the smash mode, which I really like a lot. So let's smash this and then mix that in and see what we get. So in order to smash it, you got to push all these buttons in, and then we got to find where we're gonna get some smash, hold smash. We gotta watch the output here. See, I kind of clipped it there. That looks okay. And these guys, I think. Yeah. That release, that's the magic, I think I was saying. So we got a slow attack, slow release, all the buttons pumped in, and yeah, that looks like it'll do it. Sounds pretty smashed to me. What do you think? Cool, so now let's turn the smash off for a second, go back to our original sound. Very big difference, right? Let's bring this back now. So now we're taking the volume of the smash track back. You could bring it all the way back to unity. You don't hear it at all. I personally like a little bit of distortion on drums. Your mileage may vary. But I don't know. I like that it looks 6, honestly. Leave it there. But so that's one way to very big difference. Two very drum sounds. Two very different drum sounds. Obviously, your mileage may vary. That's just another tool in the toolkit to show you a little bit about parallel compression and giving it some edge. Like, that'll really help that stick out in an overall mix. And obviously, all these mix moves are really contingent upon what the song sounds like and what you want the song to sound like. But I don't know. I think this would be a pretty cool place to start. Alright, you're right. Let's bring it back a little bit. I always go a little overboard. Alright, so one more thing I want to do to this drum mix is compress the overhead mic a bit. Because I feel like the mix is sounding good, but it's maybe a little bit dull. Let's take a listen. And I adjusted some of these volumes. Pretty good. But I think we're missing a little bit on the high end of the frequency, which this mic here, let's take a listen to it by itself. That's really where that hi-hat is living. And the other cymbals, obviously, once you let this play a little bit more, but let's compress this a little bit to bring up those cymbals. So let's get our 1176. Boom. All right, let's see what we got. Let's guess we could solo it. All right, so let's see what we got here. See, now as we bring this up, that's way too much. You can hear it, it's like almost clicking. But we'll take a little bit of that in here, I guess. Maybe something like that, but anything. Like, I don't want it to be smashing it that much. But we also have to adjust the output, so let's see. Yeah, there it is. It's all in that release. I want like a slow release on this. To let it breathe a little bit. And I guess we'll just use the attack we've been using. I don't know, that might be a little too much. Let's see what it sounds like in the context of the mix. I don't know, maybe what is that, like 15 or 12, 14, I guess. So that's what we sound like without it. Just hear how that hi-hat's coming in. Nice. I don't know, I think something like that. What about the ratio? Really smashing it. Let's stick with 4-1. Boom, I think that sounds pretty dope. What do you think? Yeah, so I think that sounded pretty good. Obviously, we'd have to make some adjustments, probably add some reverb, some plate, once we had our whole mix going, but as like a dry drum mix, those are the basics. One other quick thing with the EQ, I actually raised the EQ here on the overhead a little bit to get more of the high end out of it, because the ribbon is pretty dark. These two guys were isolated pretty much on the snare and kick. You know, a large diaphragm condenser is a lot brighter, so it's going to pick up a lot more of the high end. The ribbon sounds great, but it's also a bit darker. So for a brighter mix, using the large diaphragm condenser is great. So yeah, I just raised it up a little bit here. Subtle, but you can hear it. Just to give it a bit more of that sizzle, that top end. And that's usually a good trick or pretty standard practice. I mean, I don't want to say hard and fast rule again, but if you need more highs, don't be afraid to bump it up a little bit. Okay, so here's just some final thoughts about the mix and the steps we took. Now, I did some really simple, basic compression moves, basic EQ moves to get this to where we needed it to be. As you can see, here's the mixer. I think the two main tools that you're going to want to use when you're mixing anything is EQ and compression. Now, obviously, this isn't a full mix. This is just a drum mix. This is just to demonstrate some techniques on how to EQ and compress drums and some starting points. But personally, I think with a relatively small amount of plugins, you can get a great sound if you take the time to get ready and set to record. See how it all comes full circle? If you find yourself sitting there like manipulating something like this, your overhead mic for a long time and like really messing around with this and really warping, manipulating, changing the sound, I think there comes a point where you got to ask yourself, well, why am I trying to change this so much? Didn't I like the sound I had when I recorded? So I think if you find yourself EQing things or like taking one sound and changing it so drastically, I don't think you really need to do that if you're setting your drums up, getting ready to record. If you do the work at the recording stage, the mixing stage is so much easier, and you won't sit there manipulating things. Because I used to do that, I'll be honest, like, because I didn't really understand the process. I mean, this is a personal process I developed, and I've, looked and read things for years, so, and this is kind of the amalgamation of all those things. And this is what works for me, and I hope that it works for you and gives you a good jumping off point to record some drums. But I guess just in closing, I wanted to say thank you, obviously, for taking this course. And I really hope the techniques and tips and tricks and just nuts and bolts of recording the drums is helpful to you. I think there is a lot of information in here, and it might take a couple of views to get the entire ideas down, but all these are really basic concepts that you can really start to build out your general idea of recording on top of. One quick thing about EQ I wanted to mention, I changed some of these during the process of recording this very subtly. I mean, you can see what I did. For this one, like I said, I raised up the highs a little bit. This one I raised up around 200. That's kind of where the kick and snare were kind of living on the ribbon that I just wanted a little bit more. Don't be afraid to raise them up. I generally enjoy subtractive EQ, which is taking out frequencies. I think that by taking out, you're enhancing what's there, right? So if you have a sound you really like, by just taking things out is going to enhance it, because by taking the stuff you don't like out or taking stuff out that you can't really hear, that will be making everything else louder in a sense, rather than taking everything and making it louder. This guy, the snare mic, I took out some of the boxy frequencies when I was listening back to it. This was just not necessary for the snare mic isolated track. I just wanted to make a quick note of in case you were looking at these and like, oh, those look different. Like I did adjust them a little bit here and there. I adjusted some of the levels here and here as we went along. So But I just want to be completely transparent about what I did here and how I did it, and in case you have any questions, please feel free to hit me up, 424recording@gmail.com. Parallel compression, really powerful. That's the one thing we did. I want to mention that I did that on the room mic to get more of that, like the sound of the room in there, distorted a little bit. So that's this guy, the bus. And yeah, I like I said, I think the two main tools when you're starting out, and just in general, the two biggest concepts I think in recording are EQ and compression. And once you have a handle on those, the effects and all the other things, like that stuff, I don't know, I think is a little bit easier. I'm thinking about doing an advanced course, advanced ready, set, record drums. So keep an eye out for that one. I really hope you enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun making it. And this is Mike from 424recording.com, thanking you and wishing you well in your recording journey. Godspeed, my friends. So going forward, I'm going to be focusing more on longer form videos such as this one, and also shorter ones that are just things I'm interested in lately related to music. And the best way to support those videos and support the channel going forward is going to be at patreon.com/424recording. That's really the most sustainable way for me to keep doing the channel and keep making the vids. And it's a great way for you to support the videos and the things that you enjoy. So I want to give a special shout out to Steve, Jody, Andrew, Patty, Will, Matt, Devin, and James, and all my patrons over at patreon.com/424recording. It means a lot to me that you would support the channel, and based on everyone's support there, I decided it was a time to release this course and have it available for more people to enjoy and get information from. So if this stuff is stuff you want to support, that's a great way to do it. And there's also a bunch of affiliate links now through Zounds. They're an online music retailer. So if there's any gear that you want to get that's related to this video, all the links are in the description below. So at no extra cost to you, you can grab any sort of new gear that you might need to make the art that you want to make. I've talked a big game about gas in the past, and I think it's still a really important thing to me to get only what you need when you're buying new stuff, right? But I do recognize that, in order to do all this stuff, you do need a certain amount of gear. So if you want to help out the channel, that's a really easy way to do so. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. And as always, Godspeed, my friends, and make sure you do something you want to do today, all right?